In a sunlit Virginia kitchen, a 72-year-old retired school principal was about to hear words that would fracture her soul. What began as a simple conversation about wedding photos turned into a moment of betrayal that would redefine the meaning of family. Eleanor Ellie Montgomery wasn't an ordinary grandmother. For 40 years she had shaped young minds, known for her unwavering principles and generous heart. When her son Richard screamed those 5 devastating words, "You're dead to me, Mother," she had no idea that his ingratitude would become her liberation through an unexpected journey of self-discovery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wedding invitation sat prominently on Eleanor's refrigerator. Held by a magnet from Shenandoah National Park, a reminder of happier family vacations decades earlier. She'd spent the morning reviewing her financial statements, confirming that the $45,000 she'd transferred last month for Richard's wedding had cleared properly. The ceremony had been everything he and Melissa had wanted: an elegant vineyard. A fair in Charlottesville with string quartets, artisanal catering, and a guest list approaching 200 people. Eleanor had smiled through it all, ignoring the whispers from relatives who wondered if she could truly afford such generosity after her husband William's extended illness and death 3 years prior. The truth was, she couldn't, not comfortably. The money had come from her retirement savings, carefully built over 4 decades in education. But what was money compared to her only son's happiness? She'd convinced herself it was an investment in family, in future grandchildren, in remaining relevant in Richard's increasingly busy life. The kitchen phone rang, breaking her financial contemplation. Richard's name flashed on the caller ID, bringing an immediate smile to her face. They hadn't spoken since he'd returned from his honeymoon in Bali a week ago. "Richard, darling. How was the trip? Did you get those sunrise photos at the temple you were hoping for, Mom?" His voice was clipped, tense with the particular tone that Eleanor had learned meant trouble. It was the same voice he'd used as a teenager when caught breaking curfew, as a college student when explaining failed classes, and as an adult when asking for financial assistance. "We need to talk about the wedding." Eleanor's heart quickened. Had something gone wrong? Was Melissa unhappy with some aspect of the ceremony? "Of course, sweetheart. What about it?" "Melissa's parents are upset." Eleanor waited for more explanation, but Richard's silence stretched uncomfortably across the phone line. "About what, exactly?" she finally prompted. "About the toast you gave. About how you mentioned paying for the wedding. About how you made it sound like we couldn't have afforded it without you." Eleanor gripped the kitchen counter, confusion clouding her thoughts. She had been careful with her words, simply expressing joy at being able to contribute to their special day, thankful that her years of saving had allowed her to give this gift. She'd mentioned it in passing, a mere 15 seconds in a 5-minute speech filled with love and hope for their future. "Richard, I don't think they feel humiliated, Mom. Everyone at their country club was there. Now everyone knows they didn't pay for their daughter's wedding." "That wasn't my intention at all," Eleanor said carefully, feeling suddenly as if she were walking through a minefield. "I was just expressing gratitude for being able to help. I thought it was common knowledge that I was contributing." "Contributing? You make it sound like you threw in a few dollars for flowers. You didn't need to announce to everyone that you paid for the whole thing." The unfairness of his accusation stung. She hadn't announced anything of the sort. She'd simply said she was blessed to help give them the wedding of their dreams. Richard's revisionist version of events felt like a physical blow. "That's not what happened, Richard. It's how it came across," he snapped. "And now Melissa's parents feel like they look cheap in front of all their friends. Do you have any idea what position that puts me in with my new in-laws?" Eleanor closed her eyes, counting to 10 as she had taught countless students to do when emotions threatened to overwhelm reason. "I apologize if my words were misinterpreted. That was never my intention." "Intention doesn't matter, Mom. The damage is done." Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a familiar disappointment that had been growing for years, with each demand Richard made, with each sacrifice that went unacknowledged, with each instance of entitlement that William had warned was becoming their son's defining characteristic. "Perhaps we should discuss this in person," she suggested, hoping that face-to-face conversation might soften his anger. "I could drive up to Alexandria this weekend." "No," Richard said quickly. "That would only make things worse. Melissa is already stressed about having to see you at Thanksgiving after this. Having to see her. As if her presence would be an obligation, a burden to endure rather than family to embrace." Eleanor felt tears prick behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Not yet." Not while Richard could hear the wobble in her voice. "I see," she said, working to keep her tone even. "Then what would you like me to do, Richard?" "I think you should write an email to Melissa's parents." Apologize for overstepping and making them look bad. Clarify that they contributed significantly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But they didn't contribute at all, Eleanor said, bewilderment creeping into her voice. Richard, that would be a lie. It's damage control, Mom. Sometimes social niceties require little white lies. Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. I won't lie about something like that. I'm happy to apologize for any misunderstanding, but I won't invent financial contributions that never happened. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Eleanor could hear Richard's breathing, the short, sharp inhales that had always signaled his mounting frustration. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a dangerous calm. This is why Dad always said you were impossible to deal with. Always so righteous, so stuck on your principles that you can't see what actually matters. The invocation of William's name like a weapon struck Eleanor with surprising force. William, who had always smoothed things over between them, who had gently but firmly checked Richard's more demanding tendencies, who had never, not once in their 42 years of marriage, accused her of being impossible to deal with. Your father never said any such thing. Maybe not to your face. The casual cruelty of the insinuation took her breath away. Richard had always known exactly where to place the emotional knife for maximum impact. It was a skill she'd first noticed in his teenage years, this ability to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in others. She'd hoped he would outgrow it. That maturity would bring empathy. Instead, it had only refined his technique. Richard, she said, her educator's voice emerging, calm, authoritative, the voice that had quieted rowdy school assemblies with a single word. I understand you're upset, but I won't allow you to rewrite your father's opinions to win an argument. God, you're still treating me like I'm 12, Richard exploded, his voice rising sharply. This is exactly why Melissa didn't want you involved in the wedding planning in the first place. She said you'd try to control everything, make everything about your precious feelings and outdated principles. Eleanor felt as if she'd been doused with ice water. She had deliberately stayed out of the planning process, only offering opinions when directly asked, conscious of not overstepping. She'd written checks without questioning costs, had accommodated last-minute changes without complaint, had smiled through decisions she privately found wasteful or impractical. I see, she said quietly. And is that what you think too, Richard? I think you've never understood that sometimes being family means doing what's needed instead of what's right. Dad got that. He knew how to play the game, how to make things work in the real world instead of some moral high ground that only exists in your head. Eleanor closed her eyes against the pain of hearing William's pragmatism twisted into something unrecognizable. Her husband had been a kind man who believed in necessary compromises, yes, but never at the expense of fundamental honesty or integrity. I won't write that email, Richard. Then I guess we know where your priorities lie. His voice had gone cold, distant in a way that frightened her more than his anger. Not with your son's happiness or his new marriage. Not with family at all. That's not fair. You know what, Mom? I'm done. I've spent my entire life trying to meet your impossible standards, watching you judge everyone who doesn't live up to your perfect moral code. I'm building a new family now, with people who understand what actually matters. Richard, please, no. I'm finished. If you can't do this one simple thing to help me with my in-laws, then we're done. You're dead to me, Mother. The words hung between them, an irreversible declaration that seemed to alter the very air in Eleanor's kitchen. She felt her knees weaken and she sank onto a bar stool, her free hand gripping the counter for support. You don't mean that, she whispered. Watch me, Richard said, his voice terrifyingly calm now. Don't call. Don't email. Don't show up at our house. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a mother anymore. The line went dead, leaving Eleanor in a silence so profound she could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the pounding of her own heart in her ears. She sat motionless, the phone still pressed to her ear as if Richard might return, might laugh and say it had all been a terrible joke, might apologize for his momentary cruelty. But minutes passed, and the phone remained silent. Eventually, she set it down on the counter, her movements mechanical, disconnected from the storm raging inside her. The tears came then, not in dramatic sobs but in silent, dignified streams that tracked down her lined face. She cried for the little boy who had once brought her dandelion bouquets, for the teenager who had defended her honor when a store clerk had been rude, for the young man who had held her hand at William's funeral and promised she would never be alone. She cried for the mother she had tried to be, supportive but not smothering, generous but not enabling, loving but not blind to faults that needed addressing. Had she failed so completely that her only child could discard her over an email he wanted her to write? Had she somehow raised a man who could speak those words to the woman who had given him life? The afternoon light shifted in her kitchen. As she sat immobile, grief giving way to disbelief, then to a slow-burning anger that felt foreign in her chest. William would have known what to do, how to navigate this impossible moment. But William was gone, and she was alone with a pain that seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, her chest, her very soul. The sound of the mail slot opening broke her trance. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, rose on unsteady legs, and walked to the entryway where several envelopes lay on the hardwood floor. Bills, advertisements, a community newsletter, and a thick cream-colored envelope with the logo of her attorney's office in the corner. Eleanor picked it up with a frown. She wasn't expecting any legal correspondence. Inside was a letter reminding her that it had been 3 years since William's passing, and that she had mentioned wanting to review her will once Richard was married. The attorney suggested a meeting to discuss any desired updates, given the change in family circumstances. The timing was so uncanny that Eleanor almost laughed. Here was the universe, offering a crossroads just when she needed one most. Her will, largely unchanged since William's death, left virtually everything to Richard, the house in the historic district of Richmond that had quadrupled in value since they'd purchased it in the 1980s, the investment portfolio William had carefully built, the vacation cottage in the Shenandoah Valley, and the various family heirlooms that connected them to previous generations. All of it destined for a son who had just declared her dead to him. Eleanor carried the letter to her home office, a sun-filled room lined with bookshelves and mementos from her years as an educator. She sat at the antique desk that had once belonged to her grandfather, a circuit court judge known for his fairness and insight. What would he advise in this situation? What would William say? She reached for the phone, then hesitated. Who could she possibly call? Her closest friend, Margaret, had moved to Florida after retirement. Her sister lived in Oregon and had always found Richard challenging, making her a less than objective sounding board. Most of her other friends were former colleagues, wonderful people but not ones she would burden with such a private family crisis. The isolation of her position struck her anew. Widowed, retired, with a social circle that had naturally contracted as health issues and relocations had claimed her contemporaries. She had invested so much in being Richard's mother, in being available for him, that she had allowed other connections to wither. And what had that investment yielded? A son who could cut her off completely over an email he wanted her to write. Eleanor opened her laptop and drafted a brief email to her attorney requesting the earliest possible appointment to revise her will. Then she sat back in her chair, suddenly exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. The house around her seemed too quiet, too empty, too full of memories that now felt like they belonged to another woman's life. Her gaze fell on the framed photographs arranged on her bookshelf, Richard's graduation from UVA Law, his first day as an associate at a prestigious Alexandria firm, the day he closed on his Georgetown townhouse with Eleanor and William proudly standing beside him. In each image, she had been beaming with maternal pride, while Richard's smile had grown progressively more reserved, more distant with each milestone. Had she been blind to the growing gulf between them? Had she mistaken financial dependence for closeness, requests for help as desire for her involvement rather than simply accessing what she could provide? The phone rang again, startling her from her reflections. Her heart leapt. Richard, surely, calling to apologize, to retract those terrible words. But the caller ID showed an unfamiliar Alexandria number. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Mrs. Montgomery? This is Charlotte Banks, Melissa's mother." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. Of all the people she expected to hear from today, her new daughter-in-law's mother ranked among the least likely. They had met only a handful of times, their interactions civil but cool. Charlotte was a former beauty queen turned real estate magnate, married to a state senator. Their social circles couldn't have been more different from Eleanor's world of education and community service. "Yes, this is Eleanor," she responded, her professional voice automatically engaging, the same tone she had used with potentially difficult parents during her years as principal. "I believe we need to discuss what happened at the wedding," Charlotte said, her Virginia aristocrat's accent somehow making the statement sound like both a suggestion and a command. "I understand there was some confusion about my toast," Eleanor began carefully. "Confusion? Is that what you call it?" Charlotte's laugh was brittle. "You publicly humiliated my husband and me in front of our entire social circle." Eleanor closed her eyes, summoning patience. "That was never my intention, Mrs. Banks. I was simply expressing joy at being able to contribute to Richard and Melissa's special day. By announcing that you paid for everything? Making it sound like Senator Banks and I couldn't afford our only daughter's wedding?" "I never said I paid for everything," Eleanor countered, her patience beginning to fray. "I said I was blessed to be able to help give them the wedding of their dreams. Those were my exact words." The implication was clear, Charlotte sniffed. And now I've had 3 different women from the garden club ask me why we didn't host our daughter's wedding if we couldn't afford it. Eleanor bit back a retort about the pettiness of such concerns. I apologize if my words were misunderstood. That was never my intention. Richard says you're refusing to send an email clarifying the situation. So this was a coordinated attack. Eleanor shouldn't have been surprised, yet somehow the confirmation that Charlotte and Richard had discussed this before calling her felt like another betrayal. I'm happy to clarify any misunderstanding, Eleanor said carefully. But I won't pretend that you and Senator Banks made financial contributions to the wedding when we all know that's not true. The silence on the other end of the line was frigid. When Charlotte spoke again, her voice had dropped to a dangerous purr. I always told Melissa that Richard came from less refined stock. I see now that I was right. No understanding of social graces, no appreciation for the importance of appearances. The condescension in Charlotte's voice ignited something in Eleanor that had been dormant for too long, a righteous indignation, a refusal to be diminished by someone whose values were so contrary to her own. Mrs. Banks, she said, her voice steady and clear. I paid $45,000 for your daughter's wedding. Money I withdrew from my retirement savings after a lifetime of public service. I did this out of love for my son, expecting nothing in return except perhaps basic gratitude. Instead, I'm being treated like I committed some terrible social faux pas by acknowledging my own contribution. I find that both hurtful and absurd. Well, Charlotte sounded genuinely shocked that Eleanor had pushed back. I can see why Richard is so upset. Your attitude is appalling. My attitude? Eleanor felt a laugh bubble up, surprising her with its bitter edge. My attitude is that honesty matters. That family should appreciate sacrifices made on their behalf. That I deserve basic respect from my son and his new in-laws. If that's appalling to you, then we have very different values. Richard said you'd be difficult, Charlotte sniffed. He warned us you've always been judgmental and rigid. The casual cruelty of hearing how her son described her to his in-laws struck Eleanor like a physical blow. But it also crystallized something that had been forming in her mind since Richard's devastating call, a recognition that perhaps she had been enabling behavior that should have been confronted long ago. Mrs. Banks, Eleanor said with a calm that surprised even herself. I believe this conversation has run its course. Please tell Melissa that despite this unpleasantness, I wish her every happiness in her marriage to my son. I hope they build a life together based on mutual respect and honesty, values that seem in short supply at the moment. How dare you? Goodbye, Mrs. Banks. Eleanor ended the call, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone down on her desk. The confrontation had left her feeling strangely energized, as if she had finally removed a mask she'd been wearing. For years, the accommodating mother, the peacekeeper, the one who absorbed inconsiderate behavior to maintain family harmony. She glanced again at the letter from her attorney, now seeming like a beacon pointing toward a different future. Eleanor reached for a notepad and began to write, listing alternative beneficiaries for her estate, the education foundation she and William had supported for years, the women's shelter where she volunteered monthly, her alma mater scholarship fund for first-generation college students. As she wrote, a plan began to take shape, not just for her will, but for her life. Richard had declared her dead to him. Perhaps it was time to take him at his word and begin again, as if she truly were starting a new life. Not out of spite or revenge, but from recognition that the relationship she had tried to preserve had become fundamentally unhealthy. The doorbell rang, interrupting her planning. Eleanor made her way to the front door, half expecting to find Richard there, perhaps having reconsidered his harsh words. Instead, she found her neighbor, Gabriela Martinez, a retired literature professor who had moved in next door after her own husband's passing 5 years earlier. Eleanor, I was just dropping off these tomatoes from my garden. I've got more than I can use, and I remembered how much you like the heirloom varieties. Eleanor accepted the bag of vibrant, misshapen tomatoes, touched by the simple neighborly gesture that suddenly seemed more genuine than any interaction she'd had with her son in recent memory. Thank you, Gabriella. Would you like to come in for some iced tea? I could use the company today. Gabriella's perceptive eyes narrowed slightly, no doubt noting Eleanor's reddened eyes and the unusual catch in her voice. I'd love that, she said simply, stepping inside without further comment. As Eleanor led the way to the kitchen, she felt something shift inside her, the first tentative step toward whatever came next. Richard had made his choice. Now it was time for her to make hers. Later that evening, after Gabriella had gone home, Eleanor sat on her back porch watching fireflies rise from her carefully tended garden. The Virginia summer night was heavy with humidity and the scent of magnolias, a familiar comfort in a day that had upended everything she thought she knew about her family. Her phone lay silent on the table beside her. No calls from Richard. No apology. No retraction of those devastating words. "You're dead to me, Mother." Perhaps the most painful part was how quickly he had gone there, how those words seemed to have been waiting just below the surface, ready to be deployed. As if their relationship had been balanced on the edge of a knife for years, and she simply hadn't allowed herself to see it. Eleanor reached for the glass of bourbon she had poured herself, William's favorite, Woodford Reserve. She rarely drank, but tonight seemed to call for his particular brand of comfort. She raised the glass in a silent toast to the stars above. "Well, William," she whispered to the night air. "It seems our son has made his choice. Now I need to make mine." The bourbon burned pleasantly as she sipped it, warming her from the inside out. Tomorrow she would call her attorney. Tomorrow she would begin to sketch out a new future, one that honored the values she and William had shared rather than compromising them to placate a son who had never learned the difference between love and indulgence. For tonight, she would allow herself to grieve, not just for Richard's cruel words, but for the relationship she had thought they had, for the future grandchildren she might never meet, for the family holidays that would now exist only in memory. Eleanor Montgomery had spent a lifetime helping young people find their way. Now, at 72, she would need to find her own path forward, alone, but perhaps, finally, free. Eleanor stared at her attorney's mahogany desk, watching afternoon sunlight dance across stacks of legal documents that represented 47 years of her life's work and accumulation. 3 weeks had passed since Richard's devastating phone call, 3 weeks of silence that spoke volumes about the permanence of his declaration. The certified letter she'd sent him notifying him of today's appointment had been returned unopened, the words, "refused, return to sender," scrawled across the envelope in what she recognized as Melissa's handwriting. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Eleanor?" James Harrington asked, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the revised will she'd requested. At 78, James had been William's friend before becoming their family attorney, and concern etched deep lines around his eyes. "Disinheriting your only child is an extraordinary step." Eleanor smoothed invisible wrinkles from her linen dress, a habit from decades of presenting herself as the composed school principal even in difficult moments. "I'm not doing this out of anger or spite, James. I've had nearly a month to consider this decision." "Families argue, Eleanor. Harsh words are exchanged. But this..." James tapped the document with his fountain pen. "This is permanent. Once I file these papers, you're redirecting your entire estate, approximately $2.3 million in assets, away from Richard." The sum, spoken aloud, momentarily took Eleanor's breath away. It wasn't an extraordinary fortune by modern standards, but it represented a lifetime of careful saving, William's prudent investments, and the surprising appreciation of their historic Richmond home. When viewed as a single figure, it made Richard's ingratitude over a $45,000 wedding seem even more bewildering. "Richard declared me dead to him, James." His exact words. "He refused my letter, has blocked my phone number, and according to mutual acquaintances, has told people I'm having mental health issues that make me difficult to deal with." Eleanor's voice remained steady, though her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm simply taking him at his word and planning accordingly." James sighed heavily, the sound of a man who had witnessed too many families fractured by money and misunderstanding. "And the new beneficiaries, you're confident about them?" Eleanor nodded. "The Richmond Educational Foundation will receive the house and financial assets. They'll establish the William and Eleanor Montgomery Scholarship Fund for disadvantaged students pursuing teaching careers. The Shenandoah cottage goes to the Women's Renewal Project to provide retreats for women rebuilding their lives after domestic violence. The family heirlooms are divided between the Historical Society and my sister's children. All worthy causes, James acknowledged, but none of them are blood. Blood hasn't counted for much lately, Eleanor said quietly. Besides, I've included a revision clause. If Richard demonstrates genuine change of heart within the next 5 years, not just reconciliation to regain the inheritance, but true accountability for his actions, I can reinstate him with a simple amendment. James studied her face, perhaps searching for signs of the emotional distress that might later invalidate her decisions. Finding only calm resolve, he nodded slowly. "It's your estate, Eleanor. I'll have the final documents prepared for your signature by next week." As Eleanor left the attorney's office, stepping into Richmond's humid August heat, her phone buzzed with a text message. She fumbled in her purse, heart skipping with the irrational hope that it might be Richard, finally reaching out. Instead, she found a message from Gabriela Martinez, her neighbor. "Book club meeting moved to my house tonight. 7 p.m. bringing. Anything stronger than tea?" A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. The casual message represented something unexpected that had developed over the past 3 weeks, connection. What had begun as a neighborly conversation over tomatoes and iced tea had evolved into regular evening walks, shared meals, and eventually an invitation to join Gabriella's book club. Eleanor texted back, "I'll bring the bourbon. And that lemon pound cake you pretend not to devour." She slipped the phone back into her purse, feeling a curious lightness as she walked to her car. The weight of Richard's rejection remained, a dull ache that flared unpredictably throughout her days. But alongside it had grown something new, a tentative freedom to rediscover who Eleanor Montgomery might be when not defined primarily as Richard's mother or William's widow. That evening, as Eleanor arranged slices of pound cake on a serving plate, her landline telephone rang, a sound so rare in recent years that it startled her. Few people had this number anymore, most of her communication happened via her cell phone. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Eleanor Montgomery?" The woman's voice was unfamiliar, with a crispness that suggested professional purpose. "Speaking. This is Andrea Collins, principal at Carter G. Woodson Elementary School. I hope I'm not disturbing your evening." Eleanor's brow furrowed in confusion. She had no connection to Woodson Elementary, a school in one of Richmond's more challenging neighborhoods. "Not at all. How can I help you?" "I'm calling because your name was given to me by the district superintendent as someone who might be willing to help us with a rather urgent situation. Our after-school program coordinator has taken unexpected medical leave, and we're in desperate need of someone with administrative experience who could step in temporarily. The superintendent mentioned you've been retired for 7 years but have occasionally consulted on educational programs." Eleanor sat down slowly at her kitchen table, surprised by the unexpected request. "I'm flattered, but I'm not sure I understand. There must be current administrators better suited." Andrea's laugh held the familiar tension of a school principal in crisis management mode. "In an ideal world, absolutely. But we're facing a staffing shortage, and our program serves over 100 children who rely on after-school supervision and enrichment. It would be 3 afternoons a week, overseeing existing staff and curriculum. The superintendent spoke very highly of your abilities." Eleanor found herself glancing at the calendar hanging on her refrigerator, empty spaces stretching endlessly forward, occasionally marked with book club meetings or volunteer shifts at the women's shelter. The prospect of returning to a school environment, of having purpose and structure beyond her grief and anger, tugged at something she'd thought dormant. "When would you need me to start?" she heard herself asking. "Monday? I know it's terribly short notice. Let me think about it overnight. Can I call you tomorrow morning?" "Of course. And thank you for even considering it." After hanging up, Eleanor finished preparing the pound cake in a daze of conflicting emotions. The idea of returning to work, even part-time, hadn't occurred to her. Since William's death, she'd settled into a quiet retirement, focused on supporting Richard's increasingly demanding life. Now, with that central purpose removed, the possibility of reconnecting with the educational world that had defined her professional identity felt both terrifying and exhilarating. When she arrived at Gabriella's house that evening, the bourbon and cake balanced carefully in her arms, her neighbor took one look at her face and asked, "What's happened?" Eleanor found herself explaining the unexpected job offer to the book club, 5 women ranging in age from 62 to 81, all with strong opinions they weren't shy about expressing. "You'd be mad not to take it," declared Vivian, a retired judge with cropped silver hair and perpetually dramatic eyebrows. "Sitting alone in that big house is just marinating in misery. It's been 7 years since you were in a classroom," cautioned Helen, who had taught mathematics at the community college until her 75th birthday. "Schools have changed. The technology, the expectations, the political pressures. It's not a teaching position," Eleanor clarified. "More administrative oversight of existing programs." "The real question," Gabriella said, pouring generous measures of bourbon into crystal tumblers, "is whether you want to do it. Not whether you should or could, but whether it would bring you joy." Joy. The word hung in the air like an artifact from another time. When had Eleanor last considered joy as a criterion for her decisions? Duty, responsibility, family obligation, these had been her guiding principles for so long that the simple pursuit of personal fulfillment seemed almost self-indulgent. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "But I think I'd like to find out." The following Monday, Eleanor found herself walking through the doors of Carter G. Woodson Elementary School, dressed in a professional blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that William had given her for their 35th anniversary. The building was older than she expected, with the institutional beige walls and fluorescent lighting typical of schools built in the 1970s, but the hallways were alive with vibrant student artwork and inspirational quotes. Andrea Collinsmith. Her at the front office, younger than Eleanor had pictured, perhaps early 40s, with close-cropped natural hair and the energetic movements of someone perpetually behind schedule. Thank you so much for agreeing to help us, Andrea said, guiding Eleanor through the building. Our after-school program runs from 3:15 to 6 o'clock, serving about 120 students from kindergarten through 5th grade. We have 5 program assistants, most of whom are education students from VCU, and a curriculum that includes homework help, enrichment activities, and physical recreation. Eleanor nodded, absorbing details and noting the well-organized but clearly worn classroom spaces. The school served a predominantly low-income community, and the signs of stretched resources were evident in the mismatched furniture and dated technology. Your primary responsibility will be supervisory, Andrea continued. Making sure activities run smoothly, addressing any behavioral issues that the assistants can't handle, communicating with parents during pickup, and managing the daily attendance and documentation the state requires for our funding. They turned a corner into a large multipurpose room where children were beginning to gather, their school day just ended. The noise level rose dramatically, the controlled chaos of young energy finally released after hours of structured learning. Eleanor felt a familiar surge of both trepidation and excitement, the unique atmosphere of children navigating the complex social world of school. Everyone, Andrea called out, her voice cutting through the din with practiced authority. This is Mrs. Montgomery. She'll be overseeing our after-school program while Mr. Jackson is recovering. Please show her the same respect you show all our staff. Dozens of young faces turned toward Eleanor, expressions ranging from indifference to curiosity. A small girl with intricate braids and serious eyes approached, studying Eleanor with unnerving intensity. Are you a grandma? She asked bluntly. Eleanor smiled, kneeling slightly to meet the child at eye level. I am. But I was also a school principal for many years. The girl nodded, apparently satisfied with this credential. I'm Zoe. I'm going to be president someday, but first I need to learn fractions. A very sensible plan, Eleanor agreed solemnly. Presidents absolutely need to understand fractions. As Andrea introduced her to the program assistants, indeed mostly college students earning education credits, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The oppressive weight of Richard's rejection, which had dominated her emotional landscape for weeks, receded slightly in the face of immediate, practical demands. Here were children who needed supervision, young adults who needed guidance, and problems that required her particular skills to solve. By 6 o'clock, when the last child had been picked up and the classrooms restored to order, Eleanor was exhausted, but invigorated in a way she hadn't experienced since retirement. Her feet ached, her voice was hoarse from projecting over excited children, and her blazer bore a suspicious stain from an overturned juice box, but her mind felt sharp, engaged, purposeful. You survived, Andrea observed with a smile as they walked to the parking lot. Any second thoughts? Eleanor considered the question honestly. Actually, no. It was chaotic and challenging and exactly what I needed. See you Wednesday, then? I'll be here. During the drive home, Eleanor found herself mentally reorganizing the supply closet she'd discovered in disarray, thinking about activity modifications for a student with mobility challenges, and considering how to address the obvious tension between two of the program assistants. Professional problems, concrete, solvable, removed from the emotional morass of her personal life. When she pulled into her driveway, the house she'd shared with William for nearly 4 decades looked different somehow, not the center of her existence but simply a place she returned to after engaging with the wider world. She was contemplating this shift in perspective when she noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street and a figure sitting on her front porch steps. Eleanor approached cautiously, her keys gripped defensively between her fingers as William had once taught her. The porch light illuminated a young woman in her late 20s, dressed in business casual attire, who stood as Eleanor approached. Mrs. Montgomery, the woman asked, her voice hesitant. I'm Jessica Winters. I work with Richard at the firm. I hope you don't mind me stopping by like this. Eleanor's heart raced at the mention of her son's name. Is Richard all right? He's fine, Jessica quickly assured her. At least physically. I probably shouldn't be here. If he knew I was talking to you, he'd fire me. But I've worked as his paralegal for 3 years, and I just couldn't stand by anymore. Eleanor unlocked her front door, motioning for Jessica to follow her inside. Whatever this young woman had to say, it was better discussed privately than on her front porch. In the living room, Jessica perched awkwardly on the edge of an armchair, declining Eleanor's offer of tea or water. I need to be quick, she explained. Richard thinks I'm at a bar association event. What's this about, Jessica? Eleanor asked, too emotionally exhausted for games or gradual revelations. Richard's been telling people at the firm that you're having mental health issues. That you've become erratic and possibly dangerous to yourself since Mr. Montgomery died. He's even consulted with the firm's elder law specialist about options for emergency guardianship. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Eleanor absorbed this information. Guardianship? He's suggesting I'm incompetent? Jessica nodded, misery evident in her expression. After you changed your will. Someone from your attorney's office must have told him, because he came in absolutely furious that day, ranting about how you were unstable and vindictive. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she processed this new betrayal. James had assured her the will revisions were confidential, but law firms were intimate environments, gossip traveled, and Richard would have connections throughout Richmond's legal community. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor asked quietly. Jessica hesitated, then squared her shoulders with visible resolve. Because it's wrong. I've prepared documents for you for 3 years. I've spoken with you dozens of times on the phone. There was never any indication you were anything but sharp and kind. And, she paused. My own grandmother was put under guardianship by my uncle when she wouldn't give him money for his failing business. It destroyed her final years. I can't watch that happen to someone else. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not for Richard's manipulation, which was sadly consistent with his recent behavior, but for this unexpected alliance, this stranger's courage in the face of potential professional consequences. Thank you for telling me, she said simply. What exactly has Richard done so far? Just consultations, as far as I know. He'd need substantial evidence of incapacity, which he doesn't have. But he's been taking notes on any behavior he could potentially use, quotes from phone conversations, incidents he could reframe as confusion or paranoia. A chill ran through Eleanor at the calculated nature of these efforts. This wasn't a son concerned about his mother's well-being, this was a lawyer building a case. Is there anything else I should know? Jessica hesitated. He's planning to visit you this weekend. I heard him tell Melissa it's time to document the situation in person. I don't know what that means exactly, but it didn't sound good. After Jessica left, extracting Eleanor's promise not to reveal the source of her information, Eleanor sat alone in her living room, the grandfather clock ticking in the corner as it had through decades of family moments, birthdays, holidays. Quiet Sunday afternoons with William doing crosswords while she graded papers. The home that had once represented security now felt vulnerable, potentially weaponized against her by her own son. She reached for her phone and called Gabriella. Can you come over? She asked without preamble. I need a clear-headed friend. Right now. 20 minutes later, Eleanor had laid out the entire situation to Gabriella, who listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to analyzing complex literary texts. He can't possibly succeed, Gabriella said when Eleanor finished. You're clearly competent. You're working at an elementary school, for heaven's sake. It's not about succeeding, Eleanor replied, the educator in her identifying the core issue. It's about punishment. Even if he fails, a guardianship petition would be humiliating, potentially damaging to my reputation, and emotionally devastating. He knows that. Gabriella's expression hardened. Then we don't let it get that far. If he's coming this weekend to document your supposed instability, we make sure what he documents instead is your obvious competence and community support. How? We throw a party, Gabriella said simply. Saturday afternoon. Here at your house. We invite the book club, colleagues from your teaching days, your new coworkers from Woodson Elementary. We make it impossible for Richard to paint you as isolated or unstable when you're clearly the center of a thriving social network. Eleanor stared at her friend, momentarily speechless at the elegant simplicity of the solution. A party? To counter a potential guardianship claim? Exactly. Let him try to argue you're incompetent when you're hosting 20 people, managing conversations, and clearly connected to respected community members. We'll take photos, create evidence of our own. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep inside her, not the bitter laugh of recent heartbreak but something lighter, almost mischievous. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent decades managing school board politics and difficult parents, who had navigated educational bureaucracy and teenage crises with equal diplomatic skill. Richard had forgotten, perhaps, exactly who he was dealing with. Gabriella Martinez, Eleanor said, raising an imaginary glass and toast, you are brilliant and slightly terrifying. I taught 19th century British literature for 40 years, Gabriella replied with a wink. I know a thing or two about social warfare. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor continued her work at Woodson Elementary, finding unexpected joy in connecting with students like Zoe, whose mathematical struggles masked a brilliant, analytical mind that simply needed different approaches to learning. In the evenings, she and Gabriella planned what they jokingly called Operation Sanity Defense, enlisting the book club members in their scheme. By Saturday afternoon, Eleanor's home had been transformed. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, finger foods prepared by Helen, who had apparently been a gourmet chef in addition to a mathematics professor, filled the dining room table, and soft jazz played from the sound system William had installed shortly before his death. The first guests arrived precisely at 3, Andrea Collins from Woodson Elementary, accompanied by 2 teachers who had expressed interest in expanding the after-school program. They were followed by 3 former colleagues from Eleanor's principal days, the superintendent who had recommended her for the Woodson position, and several neighbors who had known Eleanor and William for decades. By 4 o'clock, the house hummed with conversation and laughter. Eleanor moved through the rooms with the practiced ease of a natural hostess, introducing connections between guests with similar interests, ensuring no one was left isolated, demonstrating with every interaction her obvious social acuity and mental sharpness. At 4:17, the doorbell rang again. Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Gabriella, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, before moving to answer it. Richard stood on the porch, his expression transitioning from determined to confused as the sounds of the gathering registered. Behind him, Melissa waited by their car, her posture suggesting reluctance to approach the house. "Mother," Richard said stiffly, the formal address a stark contrast to the mom he'd used all his life until their rupture. "What's going on here?" Eleanor smiled with genuine warmth, aware that several guests had drifted into the foyer behind her, witnesses to this encounter. "Richard. What a lovely surprise. We're having a little gathering, colleagues and friends. Please, come in. Both of you," she added, waving to Melissa. Richard hesitated, clearly thrown off script. This was not the isolated, potentially unstable woman he had expected to find. This was the poised, socially adept mother he'd grown up with, now surrounded by professional peers and community connections. "I didn't realize you'd be entertaining," he said carefully. "We can come back another time." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "It's been too long since you visited. Please, join us. The superintendent was just asking about you. He remembers when you gave that law day presentation at my school." She had backed him into a social corner with practiced skill. To refuse would appear rude, especially with several people now watching the interaction with interest. After a moment's hesitation, Richard stepped inside, motioning for Melissa to join him. What followed was a masterclass in social strategy. Eleanor introduced Richard and Melissa to carefully selected guests, those with the most impressive credentials, those who had known Eleanor the longest, those who could speak most eloquently about her recent contributions at Woodson Elementary. She made sure conversations highlighted her clear cognitive abilities, her active community involvement, and her ongoing professional relevance. "Your mother has been a godsend at Woodson," Andrea told Richard, apparently oblivious to the tension between mother and son. "The organizational systems she's implemented in just 2 weeks have transformed our after-school program. We're hoping to convince her to stay on permanently." "I didn't realize you were working again," Richard said to Eleanor, his tone neutral, but his eyes calculating. 3 days a week, Eleanor confirmed cheerfully. "It's been wonderful reconnecting with the educational community. Of course, I'm also busy with the women's shelter volunteer work and our book club's literacy outreach program." With each interaction, Eleanor could see Richard's strategy crumbling. Whatever documentation he had hoped to gather about her mental state was being systematically undermined by the obvious reality before him, a woman fully engaged with life, respected by her peers, and demonstrably competent in every way that would matter to a court. After 45 increasingly uncomfortable minutes, Richard made their excuses. "We have dinner reservations in the city," he explained, though the stiffness of his smile suggested the real reason for their departure. "Of course," Eleanor said graciously, walking them to the door. "It was wonderful to see you both. Do come again soon." As they reached the porch, safely out of earshot of the other guests, Richard turned to her, his voice low. "What is this about, Mother? Some kind of show to prove something?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "This is about living my life, Richard. With or without your approval or participation. You changed your will," he said accusingly. "After everything I've done for you." "Yes," she acknowledged simply. "Actions have consequences. Yours led me to reconsider where my life's work should go after I'm gone." "Is that a threat? Change your behavior or lose your inheritance?" The naked calculation in his question confirmed everything Eleanor had feared about his motivations. "No, Richard. It's a reality. You declared me dead to you over an email I wouldn't write. You can't reject me as your mother but claim rights to my estate. It doesn't work that way." Richard's face flushed with anger. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're clearly not thinking clearly. Maybe it's grief, maybe it's age, but I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, Eleanor interrupted gently. And if you're considering a guardianship petition, I suggest you look around at the 24 witnesses inside who would testify to my competence. Including 3 attorneys, a judge, and a psychiatrist. Richard's expression froze, then shifted to careful neutrality. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. And I think we both know it won't succeed. Eleanor softened her tone slightly. Richard, this doesn't have to be who we are to each other. There's a path back from this, but it starts with you recognizing that I'm not just your mother, I'm a person with dignity and autonomy who deserves basic respect. For a moment, something flickered in Richard's eyes, perhaps recognition, perhaps regret. Then Melissa called from the car, her impatience evident, and the moment passed. Goodbye, Mother, he said formally, turning away. Eleanor watched them drive away, a complex mixture of emotions churning within her. Sadness for what might have been. Grief for the relationship she had once treasured. But also, surprisingly, pride in her own strength, her refusal to be manipulated or diminished. When she returned to the party, Gabriella appeared at her side, offering a glass of wine and a questioning look. Mission accomplished, she asked quietly. Eleanor took a sip of wine, considering. I think so. At least for now. She looked around at the gathering, people connected to different chapters of her life, many of whom she had reconnected with only in recent weeks. Thank you for this. Not just for the strategic value, but for reminding me that my world is larger than I remembered. Speaking of which, Gabriella nodded toward the door where Andrea Collins was engaged in animated conversation with Vivian from the book club. I think Andrea is trying to recruit Vivian to be a reading tutor at Woodson. Your worlds are colliding in the best possible way. Eleanor smiled, feeling the first real peace she'd experienced since Richard's devastating phone call. The future. Stretching before her was not the one she had planned, not the grandchildren she had anticipated, not the family holidays she had imagined, but it was rich with possibility nonetheless. New connections. Meaningful work. Friendships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. It wasn't the life she had expected. But standing in her home filled with laughter and purpose, Eleanor Montgomery realized it might be the life she needed, not just to survive her son's rejection, but to rediscover parts of herself that had been overshadowed by decades of maternal sacrifice. She raised her glass in a small, private toast to William, to the man who had always encouraged her independence and strength. He would have approved of this moment, this reclamation of self in the face of heartbreak. Of that, she was certain. The October morning air carried the first genuine chill of autumn as Eleanor walked through the gates of Maymont Park, where vibrant red and gold leaves had begun transforming the landscape. It had been nearly 3 months since Richard's failed attempt to document her supposed instability, 3 months of profound change that had reshaped her days in ways she could never have anticipated. Mrs. Montgomery. Over here. Zoe waved enthusiastically from beneath a sprawling oak tree, where 15 children from Woodson Elementary's after-school program had gathered for their monthly outdoor science expedition. At 9 years old, Zoe had appointed herself Eleanor's unofficial assistant, a role Eleanor tacitly encouraged by giving her small responsibilities that nurtured her natural leadership abilities. Everyone has their field journals? Eleanor asked, approaching the group. The children held up colorful notebooks proudly, each personalized with stickers and drawings. What had begun as a simple leaf-collecting activity during Eleanor's first week at Woodson had evolved into an ongoing citizen science project, with students documenting seasonal changes and wildlife sightings across Richmond's urban parks. Mrs. M. I already found 3 different kinds of acorns, declared Marcus, a normally reserved 5th grader who had blossomed during these outdoor sessions. I think they're from different oak species. Excellent observation, Eleanor praised, kneeling beside him. Did you sketch them in your journal? Remember, scientists always document their findings. Andrea Collins approached, clipboard in hand and a bemused expression on her face. When you volunteered to oversee our after-school program, I had no idea you'd transform it into a junior naturalist society, she remarked. The parents can't stop talking about how their kids suddenly want to visit parks on weekends. Eleanor smiled, watching as the children dispersed in small groups, each accompanied by a program assistant. Nature was my first classroom. William. And I used to take Richard hiking every Sunday, identifying plants and animals. He knew 30 tree species by the time he was 8. The mention of Richard's name no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. The wound remained, but it had begun to scar over, becoming part of her landscape rather than defining it. Speaking of transformations, Andrea said, lowering her voice slightly, the district superintendent called this morning. The grant proposal. You helped me write for the after-school program expansion? It was approved. Full funding for 3 years. Eleanor's heart leapt. The grant represented weeks of late nights crafting budget projections and curriculum outlines, drawing on decades of administrative experience to navigate the bureaucratic requirements. That's wonderful news. When can we implement? January, Andrea confirmed. And he specifically mentioned your contribution as key to the proposal's success. Which brings me to a somewhat delicate question. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, waiting. The district is creating a new position, after-school programs coordinator for the East Richmond schools. It would involve overseeing expanded programs at 5 elementary schools, including Woodson. Training staff, developing curriculum, managing budgets. Andrea paused. They want you, Eleanor. It's a permanent position, though you could structure. It is part-time if you prefer. The offer caught Eleanor completely off guard. What had begun as a temporary favor, a way to fill suddenly empty days, had apparently evolved into something much more significant. I'm 72 years old, Andrea. Surely they'd prefer someone younger, with more recent administrative credentials. Andrea laughed. What they want is someone who got a struggling after-school program functioning smoothly in 2 weeks, then helped secure nearly $1 million in grant funding. Age is irrelevant compared to results. She touched Eleanor's arm gently. You don't have to decide immediately. The formal offer will come next week. Just think about it. As the children continued their explorations through the park, Eleanor found herself doing exactly that, thinking about a future that looked nothing like the retirement she had planned. Not the quiet days supporting Richard's family, not the grandchildren she had hoped to dote on, not the gradually diminishing circle that often characterized aging. Instead, she saw bustling classrooms, children discovering their capabilities, programs that might impact hundreds of young lives across multiple schools. A legacy beyond her own family line, built on the educational principles that had guided her entire career. Mrs. Montgomery, look. Zoe's excited voice interrupted her contemplation. The girl stood near a small pond, pointing at a great blue heron stalking elegantly through the shallows. It's the same one we saw last month. I recognize the pattern on his wing. Eleanor joined her, marveling at the child's observational skills. Excellent eye, Zoe. Make sure to note the date and location in your journal. As Zoe carefully recorded the sighting, her face serious with scientific purpose, Eleanor felt something settle within her, a quiet certainty that this unexpected chapter of her life wasn't merely a distraction from loss but perhaps the culmination of everything she had learned and become. Later that evening, as Eleanor shared the job offer news with Gabriella over dinner in her kitchen, her friend's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. You have to take it, Gabriella declared, refilling their wine glasses. This is the universe practically shouting at you about your next chapter. Eleanor laughed, slicing fresh bread from the farmer's market they had visited that morning. At my age, most people aren't starting new careers. Most people aren't you, Gabriella countered. Besides, it's not really new, is it? It's a perfect distillation of everything you've done before, applied in a fresh context. Eleanor considered this perspective as she moved around her kitchen, a space that had once felt emptied by William's absence and then by Richard's rejection. Now it was filled with new energy, herbs growing on the windowsill for the cooking experiments she and Gabriella attempted weekly, student journals she brought home to review stacked neatly on the counter, a calendar marked with book club meetings and volunteer shifts and museum exhibitions they planned to attend. You know what really gives me pause? Eleanor admitted, setting plates on the table. If I take this position, it feels like accepting that Richard won't come back. That this separation is permanent. Gabriella's expression softened. Eleanor, whether you take the job or not won't influence Richard's choices. And keeping your life on hold won't bring him back any faster. I know that intellectually. But emotionally. Emotionally, you're his mother, and part of you will always wait by the window, watching for his return. Gabriella reached across the table, squeezing Eleanor's hand. That doesn't mean the rest of you can't move forward. Before Eleanor could respond, her doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence at 7:30 in the evening. She exchanged puzzled glances with Gabriella before going to answer it. On her porch stood Jessica Winters, Richard's paralegal, looking even more nervous than during her first unexpected visit. I'm sorry to disturb you at home again, Mrs. Montgomery, she said quickly. But I thought you should know immediately. Richard resigned from the firm today. Effective immediately. Eleanor felt a cold shock run through her. Resigned? Why? What happened? Jessica glanced over her shoulder as if concerned about being observed, though the street remained quiet in the autumn evening. May I come in? Once inside, with Gabriella introduced as a trusted friend, Jessica explained. The senior partners discovered he was using firm resources to research a personal legal matter, your guardianship case. Which would have been Inappropriate but perhaps overlooked, except he was billing those hours to client accounts. He was falsifying billing records. Eleanor asked, struggling to reconcile this information with the son she had raised, the boy who had once returned to a store to report when a cashier gave him too much change. Jessica nodded miserably. It started small, from what I understand. An hour here, 30 minutes there. But when the managing partner confronted him, Richard apparently became belligerent, claimed everyone does it, that he was being singled out. And they asked for his resignation, Eleanor concluded, a deep sadness washing over her. Richard's promising legal career, the profession he had worked so hard to enter, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, now tarnished by his own ethical lapses. There's more, Jessica continued reluctantly. Before he left, he accessed your client file from when Mr. Harrington handled your husband's estate through our firm. He made copies of financial documents, old versions of your will, medical records included for the estate planning. I saw him do it, but I couldn't stop him without revealing I've been talking to you. Eleanor sat heavily in her armchair, processing the implications. Richard had failed in his initial attempt to challenge her competence through direct observation. Now he was gathering documentation for a different approach. Thank you for telling me, Jessica, she said finally. I know this puts you in a difficult position. Jessica squared her shoulders with unexpected determination. Actually, it doesn't. I gave notice today too. I can't work for a firm that allowed this situation to develop. I've accepted a position with the Public Defender's Office starting next month. After Jessica left, Eleanor and Gabriella sat in sobered silence in the living room, their dinner forgotten. He's not going to stop, is he? Eleanor finally said. Not without intervention, Gabriella agreed. This isn't just about inheritance anymore. His career is now affected. His reputation. That makes it personal in a different way. Eleanor stared at the family photographs arranged on her mantel, images spanning decades, showing Richard's progression from toddler to college graduate to successful attorney. Had there been signs she'd missed? Had she and William somehow failed to instill the ethical foundation they'd believed so essential? I need to talk to him directly, she decided. No more proxies, no more strategic parties or legal maneuvers. Just mother and son, addressing the real issues between us. Do you think he'll agree to meet? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. But I have to try. Before this escalates into something that damages us both beyond repair. That night, after Gabriella had gone home with promises to check in first thing tomorrow, Eleanor sat at William's desk in the study and composed a handwritten letter to her son. Not an email that could be ignored or deleted, not a text easily dismissed, but a physical expression of her thoughts requiring deliberate action to reject. She wrote without accusation or defensive posturing, simply stating her knowledge of recent events, her deep concern for the path he was traveling, and her desire to meet in person at a neutral location of his choosing. She concluded not with demands but with an invitation to remember who they had been to each other before money and resentment had corrupted their relationship. Tomorrow she would send it by courier to ensure delivery. For tonight, she had done what she could. 2 days later, a response arrived, not from Richard directly but from an attorney Eleanor didn't recognize, informing her that all communication should go through legal channels while matters were pending. No acknowledgement of her invitation, no personal response to her attempt at reconciliation. That's it, then, Eleanor told Gabriella as they walked through the botanical gardens the following Sunday, fall colors creating a spectacular backdrop to their serious conversation. I've tried everything I can think of to reach him personally. Now I need to protect myself legally. And emotionally, Gabriella added gently. You can't keep this wound open indefinitely, Eleanor. At some point, you have to accept that Richard has made his choice, for whatever damaged reasons drive him. Eleanor nodded, watching a family with young children feed the koi in a nearby pond, the simple joy of their interaction highlighting everything she had lost. I called James Harrington this morning. He's preparing responses to any potential legal challenges Richard might bring. And she hesitated. I called the superintendent to accept the after-school program's coordinator position. Gabriella's face lit up. Eleanor, that's wonderful. When do you start? January. I'll finish out the semester at Woodson, then transition to the district-wide role after the holiday break. She managed a small smile. It's a 3-year contract. Apparently, they're not concerned about my advanced age. They recognize wisdom and experience when they see it, Gabriella declared loyally. The children of East Richmond are fortunate to have you advocating for them. As they continued their walk, discussing the practical aspects of Eleanor's new position, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it absently, then stopped abruptly, causing Gabriella to look at her with concern. What is it? It's from Melissa, Eleanor said, staring at her phone in disbelief. Richard's wife had never contacted her directly before. She wants to meet alone tomorrow. That's unexpected, Gabriella said carefully. Do you think it's some kind of trap? More documentation a gathering? Eleanor considered the possibility. Perhaps. But I'm not sure what she could gain. That Richard hasn't already tried to collect. She typed a brief response, agreeing to meet at a cafe downtown, a public place where any interaction would have witnesses. The next afternoon, Eleanor arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, selecting a table with clear sightlines to the entrance. She had dressed with particular care, professional but not formal, the kind of outfitting she had perfected during decades of parent-teacher conferences where subtle authority was essential. Melissa appeared precisely on time, her designer handbag and expertly highlighted hair contrasting with the obvious tension in her face. She approached Eleanor's table with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the seat across from Eleanor. "I know this is irregular, given everything that's happened." "That's certainly one word for it," Eleanor replied, keeping her tone neutral. "What can I do for you, Melissa?" Melissa glanced around as if concerned about being overheard, then leaned forward slightly. "Richard doesn't know I'm here. If he found out, he'd..." She trailed off, twisting her wedding ring anxiously. Eleanor felt the first stirrings of genuine concern beneath her caution. "Is everything all right between you two?" "No," Melissa admitted quietly. "Nothing has been right since the wedding. Since before the wedding, really, but I convinced myself it was just stress, just temporary tension that would resolve once we were married." "I see," Eleanor said, though in truth, she didn't yet understand why Melissa had sought this meeting. "Richard lost his job," Melissa continued, confirming what Eleanor already knew. "He told me it was office politics, that he was being scapegoated for common practices. But then I found the legal documents he took from the firm, your documents." She met Eleanor's eyes directly for perhaps the first time. "He's been obsessed with challenging your competency, with regaining control of the inheritance. It's all he talks about, all he thinks about." Eleanor felt a profound sadness hearing her suspicions confirmed. "I'm sorry to hear that. Truly. Last night, he drank too much," Melissa continued, her voice dropping further. "He said things about what he'd do to secure his birthright. About making sure you couldn't give away what was rightfully his. It scared me, Eleanor. I've never heard him sound so unhinged." A chill ran through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the cafe's aggressive air conditioning. "Are you saying you think Richard might?" "I don't know what he might do," Melissa interrupted, genuine fear flickering in her eyes. "But I know this isn't the man I thought I was marrying. And I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you." "Because I stayed silent." Eleanor studied the younger woman carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or deception. She found only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine concern. "Why are you telling me this, Melissa? You've never seemed particularly invested in my well-being before." Melissa flinched slightly at the directness of the question. "I deserve that," she acknowledged. "I've been complicit in Richard's behavior. The wedding, the toast issue, I let my parents' social anxiety drive decisions that hurt you. I stood by while Richard cut you out of our lives over something so petty." She took a shaky breath. "My own grandmother died last year. We were very close. Seeing how Richard could discard you so easily makes me question everything about him. About us." Eleanor felt her carefully constructed emotional defenses begin to crack. This was not the conversation she had expected, not accusations or demands, but something that felt almost like an apology, or at least an acknowledgement. "What do you want from me, Melissa?" she asked directly. "Nothing," Melissa replied, surprising Eleanor again. "I just wanted to warn you. Be careful. Maybe consider staying somewhere else for a while, just until Richard calms down or gets help or..." She trailed off, unable to articulate what resolution might look like. "I won't be driven from my home by threats," Eleanor said firmly. "But I appreciate your concern. I'll take appropriate precautions." Melissa nodded, then reached into her handbag and withdrew a manila envelope. "These are copies of what Richard took from the firm. I thought you should know exactly what he has." Eleanor accepted the envelope with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you. And Melissa, are you safe? Should you be considering your own situation?" A flash of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed Melissa's face. "I'm staying with my parents for a few days. I told Richard the first needed space to think about our future." She stood, gathering her belongings. "I should go. He checks my phone. Sometimes, tracks my location." Eleanor felt alarm at this revelation. "Melissa, that's concerning behavior. There are resources, people who can help if you feel unsafe." I know, Melissa said, her voice stronger than it had been throughout their conversation. My mother connected me with a counselor who specializes in relationship issues. I'm not without support. She hesitated, then added, I'm sorry about how all this happened, Eleanor. You deserved better from both of us. After Melissa left, Eleanor remained at the cafe, processing their unexpected conversation. The envelope sat on the table before her, containing documentation of her son's determination to undermine her independence. Yet amid the disturbing implications, a strange sense of clarity emerged. This wasn't about her toast at the wedding. It wasn't about an email she had refused to write. Perhaps it had never really been about those things at all, but about deeper patterns established long before, patterns she had enabled by always smoothing Richard's path, by shielding him from the natural consequences of his actions, by prioritizing family harmony over necessary confrontation. Eleanor texted Gabriella, asking her to meet at James Harrington's office in an hour. It was time to bring her attorney fully into the situation, to establish not just legal but practical protections. As she gathered her belongings, she noticed a young mother at a nearby table struggling to manage a toddler while trying to complete what appeared to be college coursework. Excuse me, Eleanor said, approaching with a warm smile. I couldn't help noticing your little one is getting restless. I taught preschool for many years. Would it help if I entertained him for a few minutes while you finish that page? The young woman's relief was palpable. Are you sure? That would be amazing. I have a midterm tomorrow, and the babysitter cancelled at the last minute. For the next 15 minutes, Eleanor engaged the toddler with improvised games using sugar packets and spoons, drawing on decades of experience with young children. When she finally left for her attorney's meeting, the mother's grateful thanks followed her out the door. Walking to her car, Eleanor felt an unexpected lightness despite the serious concerns that had prompted her meeting with James. Life continued to present opportunities to contribute, to connect, to matter, not in the ways she had planned, but in ways that honored her essential self nonetheless. Richard's betrayal remained a wound that might never fully heal. But around that wound, new tissue was forming, the expanded after-school programs she would soon oversee, the children like Zoe who brightened her days at Woodson, the friendship with Gabriella that had introduced her to a vibrant community of women rebuilding lives after loss. As Eleanor drove to her attorney's office, autumn sunlight gilding the changing leaves along Monument Avenue, she thought about the young mother in the cafe, struggling to balance parenting with education. Perhaps there was room in the expanded after-school program for a component supporting student parents, creating safe spaces for children while their mothers or fathers pursued degrees that might change their family trajectories. The idea sparked others, a cascade of possibilities that Eleanor began mentally organizing into potential program structures. By the time she reached James Harrington's office, she had the outline of a new initiative forming in her mind, something that might serve as both professional legacy and personal redemption. Richard had declared her dead to him, had attempted to paint her as incompetent, had even potentially threatened more direct action to secure what he viewed as his rightful inheritance. These were realities she needed to address with appropriate legal and personal precautions. But they would not define her remaining years. They would not diminish her capacity to create meaningful change in her community. They would not prevent her from building a life rich with purpose and connection. As Eleanor parked her car and gathered the envelope Melissa had provided, she felt a certainty settle over her, not a naive hope that everything would somehow resolve perfectly, but a grounded confidence in her ability to navigate whatever came next. She had survived William's death, Richard's rejection, and the collapse of her expected future. She would survive this chapter too, and perhaps even transform it into something unexpectedly valuable. She straightened her shoulders, checked her appearance briefly in the rearview mirror, and stepped out of her car with the purposeful stride that had carried her through 40 years of educational leadership. Whatever Richard might do next, Eleanor Montgomery was ready, not just to defend herself, but to thrive despite him. The graduation ceremony hummed with excitement as families filled the Woodson Elementary auditorium on a warm May evening, almost 9 months to the day since Richard had uttered those devastating words that had forever altered Eleanor's life trajectory. Parents clutched bouquets and balloons, younger siblings squirmed in formal clothes, and the 5th grade students waited backstage with the nervous energy that accompanies all significant transitions. Eleanor stood at the podium, surveying the scene with quiet satisfaction. The after-school program's end-of-year celebration had evolved into something far more meaningful than a simple certificate distribution. The Future Leaders initiative she had developed over the past months had transformed how these children viewed themselves and their potential. Welcome, families and friends, she began, her educator's voice carrying effortlessly through the packed space. Tonight we celebrate not just the completion of elementary school, but the remarkable growth we've witnessed in these young people through our expanded after-school programs. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see Gabriella. In the third row, sitting beside Andrea Collins and 3 members of the book club who had become regular volunteers. In the back stood Superintendent Jackson with 2 school board members, their presence underscoring the program's success and the district's commitment to Eleanor's vision. When I first arrived at Woodson last fall, I thought I was simply filling a temporary staffing gap, Eleanor continued, allowing a smile to warm her formal delivery. What I found instead was an opportunity to reconnect with my life's purpose in an entirely unexpected way. Her gaze fell on Zoe, seated in the front row of students, practically vibrating with anticipation. The girl who had once bluntly asked if Eleanor was a grandma had blossomed into a confident young leader who had recently been accepted to the district's competitive middle school STEM academy. These children have taught me that our lives rarely follow the paths we expect, but often lead us exactly where we need to be. They've reminded me that new beginnings can happen at any age, and that our capacity to contribute never diminishes, unless we allow it to. The words resonated beyond their immediate context, reflecting Eleanor's personal journey from devastation to renewal. She hadn't planned to speak so personally at the ceremony. But standing before this community that had embraced her so completely, the truth flowed naturally. Tonight, as these students prepare to enter middle school, they carry with them not just academic preparation, but a deeper understanding of their own resilience, creativity, and potential. They've learned, as I have, that setbacks can become foundations for unexpected growth. As the ceremony progressed, each student received personalized recognition highlighting their unique contributions and growth. When Zoe crossed the stage, Eleanor abandoned protocol to give her a brief hug before presenting her certificate and the special leadership medal she had earned through her work mentoring younger students. Mrs. Montgomery changed everything, Zoe declared unexpectedly into the microphone, her voice carrying the absolute certainty unique to 9-year-olds. She made us believe we could be scientists and presidents and anything we want. And she never treats us like we're just kids. The spontaneous testimonial brought applause from the audience and a suspicious moisture to Eleanor's eyes that she quickly blinked away. This was not a moment for sentimentality but for celebration of genuine achievement. After the ceremony, as families mingled during the reception, Eleanor found herself approached by parents who had once viewed her with the casual indifference often directed toward school staff. Now they sought her out, expressing gratitude for specific ways the program had impacted their children and, in many cases, their entire family dynamics. Ms. Montgomery, a young woman called, navigating through the crowd with a toddler balanced on her hip. Eleanor recognized her immediately, the student mother from the cafe months earlier, though they hadn't interacted since that brief encounter. Tanya, Eleanor greeted her, pleased to have remembered the name. How wonderful to see you again. Did you pass that midterm? The young woman's surprise at being remembered quickly melted into a smile. I did, with an A. And I wanted to thank you for something you probably don't even realize you did. Oh? After we met, I mentioned to my son's teacher how you'd helped me that day. She told me about the parent support component of the after-school program you were developing. I applied, and Michael's been attending 3 days a week while I take classes. Tanya's eyes shone with emotion. I'm graduating next month with my associate's degree. First person in my family with any college education. Eleanor felt a profound satisfaction that transcended any personal accomplishment. This was the multiplicative effect of educational investment, one life improved creating ripples that extended to families, communities, generations. That's wonderful, Tanya. Truly. I've been accepted to Virginia Commonwealth for their teaching program, Tanya continued. I want to do what you're doing, create spaces where education becomes accessible to everyone, not just those with perfect circumstances. As the reception continued, Eleanor found herself engaged in one meaningful conversation after another, each reinforcing the unexpected gifts this chapter of her life had brought. When the event finally concluded and the custodial staff began the process of returning the auditorium to order, she lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of the evening behind. Quite a triumph, Gabriella observed, joining Eleanor as she gathered her materials from the podium. The superintendent couldn't stop talking about how the program metrics have exceeded every projection. Attendance up 40%, academic improvements across all demographics, parent engagement through the roof. Eleanor smiled, tucking her speech into her portfolio. Numbers are important, but they're not what I'll remember about tonight. Zoe's speech? Gabriella guessed. That, and Tanya's story, and Marcus showing his grandmother the nature journal he's kept all year. Eleanor shook her head slightly, still processing the evening's emotional impact. When Richard rejected me, I thought I'd lost my primary purpose, being a mother, eventually a grandmother. What I found instead is that my purpose was always larger than I realized. Gabriella squeezed her arm affectionately. Speaking of which, we should get going if we're going to make your celebration dinner. The book club is probably already at the restaurant ordering wine and interrogating your attorney about his love life. Eleanor laughed, picturing James Harrington's dignified discomfort under Vivian's forthright questioning. Poor James. He only agreed to join us because he's delivering the final paperwork. As they walked to the parking lot, the warm Virginia evening wrapping around them like a benediction, Eleanor felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the legal documents awaiting her signature. Tomorrow would mark the official finalization of her revised estate plans, with the educational foundation firmly established and all possible legal challenges addressed through meticulous planning. But the real milestone had been reached months earlier, when she had finally stopped waiting for Richard to return and embraced the life that was actually before her. The restaurant Gabriella had selected for the celebration occupied a converted historic home in Richmond's Fan District, its private dining room intimate enough for meaningful conversation while accommodating their expanded circle of friends. As predicted, the book club members had already arrived, along with Andrea Collins, 2 staff members from the women's shelter where Eleanor volunteered, and James Harrington, who looked simultaneously uncomfortable and pleased to be included. There she is, Vivian declared as Eleanor and Gabriella entered. The woman of the hour. We ordered champagne, the good kind, not the stuff that gives you a headache before you've even finished the first glass. Eleanor accepted the offered flute with a smile, settling into the chair clearly designated as hers by the small wrapped package placed at its setting. You didn't need to bring gifts. This dinner itself is more than enough. It's not from us, Helen explained, nodding toward James. Your attorney brought it. Said it arrived at his office with instructions to deliver it tonight. Eleanor glanced at James, who offered a slight shrug. It was courier delivered yesterday. Addressed to you in care of my office. I had it scanned and checked, of course. Given recent events. Recent events, a delicate reference to the restraining order Eleanor had reluctantly but necessarily obtained 3 months earlier, after Richard had appeared at her home late one night, intoxicated and belligerent, demanding to know why she was wasting his inheritance on those people's children. With careful fingers, Eleanor unwrapped the small package to reveal a velvet jewelry box. Inside, nestled on black satin, lay a pearl brooch she recognized immediately, her mother's, passed to her on her wedding day, which she had in turn given to Melissa at the rehearsal dinner before the wedding. A note accompanied it, handwritten on heavy stationery. Eleanor, I'm returning this family heirloom, which belongs with you. Richard and I have separated, and divorce proceedings are underway. I want no part of family treasures that should remain in your keeping. I'm relocating to Boston next month to begin a position with a nonprofit supporting women returning to education after life disruptions. Your example of resilience and reinvention has not been lost on me, though I doubt we'll have further contact. With respect and regret for my role in what transpired, Melissa. Eleanor stared at the note, then at the brooch, emotions cascading through her, surprise at the contact, vindication at the implicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing, sadness for the marriage's failure despite its predictability. Eleanor? Gabriella prompted gently. Is everything all right? Eleanor passed her the note. Melissa is divorcing Richard. She returned my mother's brooch. As Gabriella read the note silently, the others at the table maintained a respectful quiet, aware of the complexity beneath this seemingly simple gesture. Well, Vivian finally said, raising her champagne glass, it appears at least one person in that situation has found their moral compass. I propose a toast, not to that specific news, which I imagine brings mixed feelings, but to the return of what rightfully belongs to you, both tangible and intangible. To reclamation, Helen added, lifting her glass. To new chapters, Andrea contributed. To unexpected journeys, Eleanor concluded, completing the toast as the glasses clinked together in the warm light of the private dining room. As dinner progressed, the conversation flowed naturally between professional achievements, personal anecdotes, and plans for the summer ahead. Eleanor found herself at the center of a community she could never have envisioned a year earlier, diverse in age, background, and perspective, yet united by shared values and genuine affection. Before we moved to dessert, James said during a natural lull in conversation, I should deliver the official news, which is really why we're celebrating tonight. The William and Eleanor Montgomery Educational Foundation has received final approval from the IRS for its nonprofit status. The endowment transfer is complete, and the first scholarships can be awarded for the fall semester. A round of applause circled the table, along with exclamations of congratulation and questions about the foundation's specific aims. 5 full scholarships annually for education students committed to teaching in underserved communities, Eleanor explained. Plus a special category for parent students like Tanya, who are balancing education with child-rearing. The scholarship includes not just tuition but childcare stipends. And the house? Gabriella asked, knowing this had been the most emotionally charged aspect of Eleanor's estate planning. Upon my death, it will become the foundation's headquarters, with the garden level converted to a parent-student resource center providing tutoring, childcare, and academic support services. Eleanor smiled at the synchronicity of it all. William would have loved the symmetry, our home becoming a place that nurtures new generations of educators and learners. As the evening continued, Eleanor found herself observing more than participating, taking mental photographs of this gathering that represented her reconstructed life. Each person present had entered her world after Richard's devastating declaration, each connection forged during what could have been her darkest chapter but had instead become a renaissance. When the celebration finally concluded and goodbyes were exchanged in the restaurant's parking lot, Gabriella offered to drive Eleanor home. You've had champagne, and besides, I want to hear more about this foundation launch. The actual mechanics of it all. In the car, however, their conversation turned more personal. Are you really okay about Melissa's note? Gabriella asked as they drove through Richmond's quiet streets. It must bring up complicated feelings. Eleanor touched the velvet box in her purse, feeling the weight of family history it contained. It does. Sadness that Richard's marriage has failed, though that seemed inevitable. Gratitude for the return of something precious. Curiosity about Melissa's new path, which sounds remarkably aligned with values she once seemed to reject. And Richard? Any word? Eleanor shook her head. Not directly. James says his attorney has been notified that all challenges to my competency have been formally withdrawn. Apparently, Richard's new legal counsel advised him that continuing would only damage his own interests further. Small mercies, Gabriella murmured. Indeed. Eleanor gazed out the window at the familiar landmarks of her beloved city, now seeming somehow both unchanged and entirely new. You know what surprises me most about all of this? Not Richard's behavior, which follows patterns established long ago that William and I failed to address properly. Not even my own resilience, which I've relied on through other losses. What, then? The abundance that's flowed into my life precisely when I stopped trying to preserve what I thought I needed. Eleanor turned from the window to look directly at her friend. I lost my son, or rather, he rejected me in the cruelest possible way. That should have been devastating beyond recovery. And it was painful, deeply so. But in its aftermath came you, the book club, Woodson Elementary, Zoe and all those remarkable children, the foundation, purpose beyond anything I could have imagined at 72. Gabriella smiled as she navigated the final turn onto Eleanor's street. There's a term in psychology, post-traumatic growth. The concept that some people don't just recover from profound loss but actually experience positive transformation because of it. That resonates, Eleanor acknowledged. Though I'd never want to suggest that Richard's cruelty was somehow necessary for this new chapter. I'd have preferred reconciliation, relationship, the future I'd envisioned with grandchildren and family. Holidays. Of course. But given what actually happened, you've created something remarkable from the ashes. As they pulled into Eleanor's driveway, the security lights activated automatically, illuminating the Victorian home she had shared with William for nearly 4 decades. The house looked different now, the garden redesigned with Gabriella's guidance to include more native plants, the porch furnished with comfortable chairs that invited evening conversation, the interior gradually transformed from a memorial to her marriage into a reflection of her current life. Would you like to come in for tea? Eleanor offered as Gabriella parked. I'm not quite ready for this day to end. Inside, as Eleanor prepared the tea they had discovered at a local Asian market during one of their weekend explorations, she found herself reflecting on the upcoming summer. The school year was ending, but her work would continue as she developed curriculum for the expanded after-school programs launching across 5 schools in September. Zoe and several other students had enrolled in the summer science camp Eleanor had helped design, ensuring continuity in their learning and connection. The foundation board would meet monthly to review scholarship applications, with the first recipients to be announced in August. I've been thinking, Gabriella said as Eleanor set the teapot and cups on the coffee table. About that cottage in the Shenandoah Valley you mentioned. The one that's part of your estate plan for the women's shelter. What about it? Eleanor settled onto the sofa, tucking her feet beneath her in a casual posture that would have been unthinkable in her previous life as the always composed school principal and Richard's proper mother. You mentioned you haven't visited since William's death. That it's been sitting empty except for basic maintenance checks. That's true, Eleanor acknowledged. Too many memories, I suppose. William and I spent every summer there for decades. Richard learned to fish in that stream, built his first campfire in that clearing. What if, Gabriella proposed carefully, we organized a retreat there this summer? Not just you and me, but the whole book club, maybe Andrea and some of the other women we've connected with this year. A week of hiking, reading, conversation, a celebration of this community we've built. Eleanor considered the suggestion, visualizing the stone cottage with its wide porch and the Blue Ridge Mountains rising behind it. For so long, she had preserved it as a mausoleum to family memories, unable to imagine new experiences in that sacred space. But now, with nearly a year of transformation behind her, the idea of filling it with fresh voices and laughter held unexpected appeal. I think William would approve, she said finally. He always said spaces needed to be lived in to maintain their soul. Is that a yes? Gabriella pressed, smiling. It's a yes, Eleanor confirmed. Let's plan it for July, after the foundation launch but before the fall program preparations intensify. As they continued discussing logistics for the retreat, Eleanor felt a sense of completion circle through her, not an ending, but a reconnection of fragmented pieces into a new whole. The cottage that represented her past would now host her present. The life she had thought irrevocably shattered had reassembled itself in a configuration she could never have designed but now embraced wholeheartedly. Later that night, after Gabriella had gone home and Eleanor prepared for bed, she found herself drawn to her study where framed photographs chronicled her life's journey. William on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and serious. Richard's graduations from high school, college, law school, milestones she had celebrated with uncomplicated pride before understanding the flaws in his character that success would magnify rather than resolve. Alongside these familiar images now stood newer additions, Eleanor with the Woodson Elementary staff at the holiday party, the book club in theatrical poses during their Shakespeare reading night, Zoe proudly displaying her science fair project on urban wildlife habitats. Eleanor lifted the velvet box containing her mother's brooch, opening it to study the carefully arranged pearls that had witnessed 3 generations of her family's history. Tomorrow she would take it to be cleaned and repaired where one pearl had loosened, then wear it to the foundation's inaugural board meeting next week, a tangible connection to her lineage even as she established a new legacy. Her phone chimed with an incoming text message, unusual at this late hour. Eleanor reached for it, finding a message from Andrea Collins. Just heard from the district. Our program has been selected for the National Education Association's Innovation Award. They specifically cited your intergenerational mentoring component as a model for districts nationwide. We're going to Washington in October to accept. Sleep well knowing you've changed the educational landscape in ways that will outlast all of us. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, absorbing this unexpected recognition. When she had agreed to temporarily oversee Woodson's struggling after-school program 9 months ago, she could never have imagined this trajectory, from emergency staffing solution to nationally recognized educational innovator at an age when most people had long since retired from public contribution. Richard's cruel words, "You're dead to me, mother," had been intended to diminish her, to punish her for maintaining boundaries he couldn't respect. Instead, they had inadvertently launched her into the most creative and expansive chapter of her professional life, forcing her to rebuild an identity independent of maternal sacrifice and familial obligation. Eleanor set her phone on the nightstand and prepared for sleep, suddenly aware of the profound difference between this evening's peaceful contentment and the devastating night nearly a year earlier when Richard's rejection had seemed to shatter her world beyond repair. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely, she doubted it ever would. A mother's heart doesn't simply stop loving a child, regardless of their behavior. But around that persistent ache had grown a life of such unexpected richness that the wound no longer defined her experience. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor found herself mentally composing a letter she would likely never send. Dearest Richard, when you declared me dead to you, after I refused to compromise my integrity for your convenience, you believed you were delivering the ultimate punishment. Perhaps you expected me to collapse under the weight of your rejection, to beg forgiveness for maintaining boundaries you found inconvenient, to sacrifice my principles to regain your approval. Instead, you inadvertently gave me the greatest gift, freedom to rediscover who I am beyond the role of your mother. Freedom to reconnect with my essential purpose as an educator and community builder. Freedom to form relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. I would never have chosen this separation. I grieve daily for the relationship we might have had, for the grandchildren I may never know. But I have learned that grief and gratitude can coexist, grief for what was lost alongside gratitude for what that loss inadvertently created. My door remains open should you ever wish to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. But I no longer wait. By that door, my life suspended in anticipation of your return. I have built something beautiful and meaningful from the ruins of your rejection, something that will outlast both of us and touch lives neither of us might ever know. That is my revenge, though I never sought one, to have transformed your cruelest moment into the catalyst for my greatest contribution. With enduring love, despite everything, your mother Eleanor would never send these words, never use communication as a weapon as Richard had done. But articulating them, even silently, felt like the final step in her journey from devastation to renewal. Tomorrow would bring foundation meetings and curriculum development, mentoring sessions with aspiring educators and planning for the summer retreat. Her calendar overflowed with commitments that reflected not obligation but authentic purpose. Not desperate distraction from loss but genuine engagement with possibility. Richard had declared her dead to him after she paid for his wedding. In response, she had cancelled his inheritance and left, not just his expectation of financial windfall, but the limiting identity that had kept her tethered to his approval. What he had intended as punishment had become liberation, proving once again that the greatest power lies not in inflicting pain but in transforming it into unexpected grace. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor Montgomery, educator, foundation director, mentor, friend, rested in the peaceful certainty that her life's most significant chapter had not ended with her son's rejection, but had rather begun because of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.